All right, so the next set of readings you had to contend with was Virginia Woolf, a portion of her in Search of a Room of Her Own, and then the fairy tale Sleeping Beauty from the Saloon. This was one that a lot of you pointed to as actually making sense in terms of a connection. That doesn't surprise me at all, because it is they are more fairly obvious connections. And I think Virginia Woolf, um, even though it's 1929 when she writes it, most of us are very familiar with still the sorts of issues that women deal with in terms of equality and recognition. Socially, that remains a sort of foregrounded struggle for us, and so we're sort of attuned to those ideas. Um, and so with Sleeping Beauty, where you have this woman who's defined by the two qualities of physical beauty and passivity, we recognize those as concerns of the feminist movement. And when you have stories that are centered on a female character who lacks agency to that degree, those are obvious connections to us. And of course, it's what you see in a lot of fairy tales, and it's the criticism of a lot of feminist writers of fairy tales is that they continue to perpetuate and have over the centuries and even into contemporary society perpetuate these ideas that the greatest virtue a woman can have is her physical beauty and grace, and that she should remain passive. Men are active, women are passive. Sleeping Beauty certainly stands as a sort of prime example, along with Rapunzel, um, of what's called the cloistered woman, or just the woman in the tower, right? So with Virginia Woolf, the focus tends in the classroom discussion to be on this hypothetical sister of Shakespeare that she comes up with. She's talking about a lot of the same things that Fry and Googie were talking about in terms of the development of the literature and its importance in conveying culture and values, and that sort of thing. The question just becomes, why is it so dominated by men up until at least the 20th century? And what she's trying to point out is that being a successful author, poet, novelist, playwright was difficult for everybody. She concedes that, right? It wasn't easy for the men most of the time either. But she's trying to point out that the literature would suggest that women were these objects of great regard, right? That you read about all these women in literature and in poetry, and they're on a pedestal. They're muses. Men idolize them. They're beautiful. They're powerful. Um, she says the reality is quite otherwise. I mean, those are only the products, she says, of the masculine imagination. So that's right back to Fry. Um, and so that's those are the kind of connections you want to make between the essays, the development of these ideas. But it's really interesting to think about the fact that there probably were women who, of course, women who had the intellect and the creativity to be able to produce that kind of work, but they weren't, she says, for basically one reason, and that was the hostility of the environment in which they lived. Not only did they have to contend with all the physical demands that the men have to deal with, which is first obtaining food and a bit of privacy and some time to actually write. She said the world was indifferent to them, so it would look at Keats or it would look at Shakespeare, or it would look at Dickens and go, you want to write? Whatever, we don't care, right? Good luck to you, and if you're successful, so be it. She said for women it was more hostile. They would look at the woman and say, you want to write? Well, no, because I need you to get back in the kitchen and cook my soup, and I need you to, fix my pants so that I can go back out on the farm tomorrow, and I need you to do all these other things. Right, and so the world was aggressively hostile towards the women. They were denied systematically education, which is something she's very clear about in that hypothetical situation. The advantage that William Shakespeare would have had over Judith Shakespeare, had she existed, was that he would have been sent to school, educated, to afford him the opportunity to become a great writer, and she would have been married off. So the outcome, what's really interesting to me here as we look at the fairy tales, the outcome, according to Virginia Woolf, is that when you have that kind of creative force inside you and that passion and that intellect, and there's no outlet for it, she says the only really conceivable result is either suicide. So her hypothetical Judith drowns herself after she becomes pregnant, and we see women doing that even in Shakespeare and in a variety of other literary texts. These great women who have no outlet for their agency, the only thing they have control over is to kill themselves. She says the other possibility is they end up out at the edge of society somewhere in a hut as a witch or a sorceress. And that's exactly what we see in the fairy tales. If you've ever wondered why these old women live in these houses out in the middle of the woods, um, and they're always villains, they're portrayed as witches, and it's likely, if not consciously, at least subconsciously, an expression of the anxiety of a masculine, misogynist society, really, about women with agency and creativity, women with ideas. Get them out, right? Get the crazy woman, get out of society, and they become witches and sorceresses. And so I think that's an interesting um, connection to make there. And of course, with Beauty and the Beast, again, her gifts are underutilized. She's actually gifted with wit, basically intellect and creativity, but they're underutilized, right? She's simply passive. She sleeps. And just as sort of an aside, the most amusing part of the story to me is that when she wakes up, um, she sees the prince sitting there, and he literally just walked in the room, and her remark to him is, "Oh, you've had to wait so long." She hasn't waited at all. He just got there. She's been waiting for 100 years. So this real focus on centralizing the man and his priority to the story is both sad and humorous, I think. So that's a little bit of what we talk about there.